This is Jessie, and you're listening to the Curious Cabinet Podcast. Hey everyone, I hope you're doing good these past 2 weeks. I took a little break off, and I'm just trying to regroup myself. But anyway, so I have a really fun podcast today. I'm super excited about it. I love a good ghost story, and I feel like I don't do enough of them. I'm trying to break it up and do some different things. So today I am talking about the Enfield Poltergeist. And you'd be familiar with this if you've watched The Conjuring. They take some elements of that and put it into that movie. I haven't seen it in so long, I don't even remember what happens. But The Conjuring 2, I believe it was. And there's other documentaries and stuff about it. I watched one on YouTube. It was the BBC documentary. But anyway, so let's get to it. Now, the haunting revolves around the Hodgson family. And we're going to start with Peggy, who is the mom. Peggy Hodgson was born Margaret Burcombe. Peggy is a nickname for Margaret, if you didn't know. In the London area in the 1930s. She grew up during World War II in a working-class family. She later compared the events of what happened to her in her Enfield home to Germany's assault on England. She was described as a sensible, honest, and strong, down-to-earth woman. She had a good reputation, she kept a clean home, and she was very protective of her children. She also had some health issues described as epileptic episodes, which contributed to her ill health before the 1977 events. Now, she married Anthony Tony Hodgson in 1962, and the young couple moved to their home at 284 Green Street in Brimstown, Enfield, England, around 1964 or 1965. Their oldest daughter Margaret was about 18 months old at the time they moved in. And after that, they had 3 more children, Janet, Johnny, and Billy. Tony had children before that, and apparently he had been married 4 times in total, and had at least 7 children total. Now, Margaret described her father as a ladies' man. And Tony does not sound like a winner. Tony is not a good person, apparently, because their marriage ended in separation and divorce around 1977, from what Margaret has said. Apparently, he left the family after getting another married neighbor pregnant. And like I said, Tony is not a winner. We do not like Tony. Now, this left Peggy a single mother when the family was already struggling financially, and this obviously spiraled them into deeper poverty and created even more stress within the home. Peggy began to raise 4 kids alone. And I guess early on, she dismissed any random knocking or anything like that because she was under such immense stress that this wasn't something she was focusing on. And I was wondering about that the whole time I was writing this. I wonder how much went unnoticed because it just wasn't anything to focus on. If there was an issue with the house, that wasn't going to be her first issue. It was, putting food on the table. But anyway, so despite the marital problems and the pain of their father leaving, the family remained close, and Peggy did the best she could. Now, in 1977, when everything started, Margaret was 14, Janet was 11. Johnny was 10. And he had some behavioral issues, so he was often away at special school. And Billy was 7, had a speech impediment. But the disturbances in the home began quickly and also escalated very quickly. So on August 31st, 1977, Janet and her brother Johnny were upstairs in their shared bedroom alone when they heard a shuffling, like furniture being dragged around or feet moving across the floor. Later on, Janet had described it as something moving around near the chest of drawers, like somebody walking around the chest of drawers trying to move it. So the mom heard this, Peggy, and she comes upstairs assuming that the kids are just being playful but kind of rough because they're being loud. So she comes in and the shuffling stopped, but then there was like a loud knocking that started coming from the walls, like a very distinctive rhythmic knocking. And all 3 of them had heard the knocks very clearly. But suddenly, the heavy chest of drawers, it was solid wood filled with clothes, probably weighing around 50 to 70 pounds, and was too heavy for any child to have moved, slid forward about 18 inches across the carpet with no one touching it. So Peggy felt like just push it back against the wall. I don't know why she wouldn't freak out at that point. So she took a couple of tries trying to do so. It was a heavy piece of furniture. And she said on the 3rd try, it resisted as if something was like holding it in place or pushing it against her to move it forward again. She said it wasn't subtle and it felt very deliberate and threatening, almost as if it wanted to trap them in the room, like move the dresser in front of the door. So naturally, the family did what they should do, which you don't see in every kind of horror movie, and they bolted next door to the neighbor's home, Vic and Peggy Nottingham at 282 Green Street, which was, it was a duplex, so they shared walls. Now, Vic was a builder, and the kids knew their son, Gary. They were all friendly. So Vic comes back to the house with Peggy, and Peggy Hodgson. Now it gets kind of confusing. I'll try to remember to say the last names. Just, to check it out. And then Vic hears the knocks too. They come from the furniture, the walls, the ceilings, and Vic is a builder, like I said. So he is being very skeptical and trying to make sense of what is really happening because it just doesn't make sense. So he starts trying to figure out if it's pipes or structural issues, maybe even rats in the walls or something like that. But he found nothing that could have explained the knocks. They continued to follow him around, like almost stalking his every move, and they seemed quite intelligent. Now, the Hodgson family has had no history of like weird pranks or anything like that. And the Nottinghams immediately backed them up and saying that this is the event that triggered everything. On September 1st, around 1 a.m., with, no rational explanation of what was going on, Peggy Nottingham, the neighbor, had called the police. Police Constable Carol Weeps arrived with Police Constable or Sergeant Hyams. Now, the family and the Nottinghams were gathered in the dimly lit living room as they waited for police to arrive. There were 4 distinct knocks when they first came in. And the first one came from the wall that the Nottinghams shared with the Hodgsons, and the rest from a different wall. The officers checked the pipes, the attic, and the exterior of the home, and they found nothing. Then, with everyone still in the room, one of the children had pointed at an armchair that seemed to be kind of wobbling slightly. It then lifted off the floor, maybe half an inch, and slid 3 to 4 feet across the room toward the kitchen wall. Now, Constable Heaps witnessed it and later signed a sworn affidavit on September 10th, stating, these are the exact words, I looked at the chair and noticed that it was wobbling slightly from side to side. I then saw the chair slide across the floor, approximately 3 to 4 feet, and came to a rest. At no time did it appear to leave the floor. I checked the chair but couldn't find nothing to explain how it moved. She tested for a slope by rolling a marble on the floor, and it didn't move. There were no wires, no tricks, nothing. And Constable Hyams corroborated the knocks and the general oddity. He told investigators that there was definitely something that he could not explain. The police left because, really, I think they left around dawn because there's really nothing they can do at this point. Nobody's doing this to them. How are they going to fight a ghost? But also Vic Nottingham signed a statement confirming that exactly what happened that night. And really, the police have no reason to fabricate the truth about what happened. They were a crucial piece of evidence, to the beginning, being a witness, because why would the police lie about that kind of stuff? Anyway, so on September 1st, after the police had left the home around dawn, the activity didn't stop. And almost immediately after they left, Lego bricks and marbles began flying through the air, zooming around the house at high speeds. It was almost like something some were dropping from the ceilings or coming from the walls or windows, just out of the walls and windows. And the Nottinghams were still there. Vic and Gary witnessed the toys flying through the air. The knocking on the walls also continued and seemed to follow people from room to room. Now, this caused the children and the whole family to get really upset. The children were so distressed. The family was sleeping poorly, and they were kind of congregating more and more. And it was, something like this can really break a family up, but it kind of made them stick together a little bit closer, which is really nice to hear. But Peggy Hodgson told the investigators that it felt like the house was almost alive. There were objects constantly moving around the house, even when she was alone in a room. So over the next few days, around September 2nd to 3rd, the phenomena kind of settled into a pattern. The marbles and Lego bricks continued to fly through the air so fast that people were comparing them to cricket balls being hit. At one point, Vic was actually attacked with flying Legos and bricks while he was checking the house. They came flying at him, either whizzing by him or actually hitting him. Small objects like teaspoons, boxes, or marbles were seen moving or dropping from nowhere. And each incident began to terrify the family more and more. This wasn't just one night of a strange event. This was relentless chaos. And Peggy began to talk to the entity and try and reason with it, asking it to stop because the children desperately needed to sleep. And I'm sure she did too. But how can you sleep? I couldn't sleep in that situation. How could you get comfortable? So, Vic and Peggy Nottingham kept coming over to help check the house because of the activity. And Vic was really still trying to make sense of what was going on. Vic was rational. He was a builder, and they, like I said, have no motive to exaggerate their experience at all. Now, by the end of the next few days, the Hodgson family had become just completely scared out of their wits. The children were screaming and crying during the worst of the events, and they were still hoping that everything would just stop as quickly as it started. So on September 4th, this was the day that everything kind of started to go public, because this was also the single most documented day within the first few weeks. Peggy Nottingham decided to call the Daily Mirror newsroom. She was looking for anyone who might possibly want to help them with the situation and told them about the strange events that were taking place next door. Now, reporter Douglas Bentz and photographer Graham Morse came over right away. They admitted later that they expected this to just be the crazy neighbor story and nothing to really be happening. So when they came, they were offered tea. And they hung out in the room and were introduced to all the children, and they all seemed calm and they were playing normally, and there wasn't really any activity. They were there for about 20 to 30 minutes and were like, okay, it's time to go. Nothing's happening. And then as they started to walk out to their car, Vic Nottingham came running outside yelling, "It's happening again." They rushed back inside, and again, chaos everywhere. Lego bricks and marbles flying around the room so fast you couldn't see them. Now, Graham Morris stood in the kitchen area watching what was happening, just in complete disbelief. He was then hit in the forehead, by a Lego brick. And he said, "Suddenly things just took off and started flying around the room. I got hit by a Lego brick right over my right eye. It gave me a lump for a few days. There was a bit of force. I was watching all of the family and none of them was doing anything." Margaret and Janet were crying and screaming, and Billy was still kind of trying to play amid the debris, and Peggy was obviously distressed. Douglas Bentz later said the whole family seemed absolutely terrified, and you can't fake that type of fear. Morris was adamant that none of the family participated in the objects being thrown around the room, and that they were flying at such a high speed no one would have been able to recreate it, especially children. On September 7th, two other reporters, George Follows and David Thorpe, returned to the house and also experienced similar activity. So this coverage was printed on the front page of September 10th, 1977 paper with the headline, "The House of Strange Happenings." So this is obviously when things started becoming more repetitive with the small objects flying through the airs like Legos and marbles, and it became a consistent thing. The genuine terror from the family proved that they were not faking this. Plus the multiple witnesses. How many witnesses we have already? Like 10 witnesses. And this is like all within the first week that this stuff started happening. So it's kind of hard to fake things like that around so many people. You know, if it was one or two and they were like, "Oh, I saw this," I would understand. But there's a lot of witnesses. So now, Maurice Grosse was a 58-year-old inventor and a prominent SPR, I'll say SPR all the time, but Society for Psychical Research investigator. He was born in London, and he later moved to Tottenham. And as a young boy, he showed a talent for science very early on. He served in the Territorial Army's Royal Artillery during World War II, including the Dunkirk evacuation in 1940, and was commissioned in 1941. He married Betsy Yanni in 1944 and had 4 children with her, 3 daughters and a son. And after the war, he became a very successful inventor. And his most well-known invention was the rotating advertising billboard, along with vending machines and the automatic newspaper dispensers that were sold worldwide. So he was also known to be a gifted artist. And so this guy's just super smart and talented. Sadly, his youngest daughter, Janet, had suffered grave injuries in a motorcycle accident in 1976 and sadly passed away at the age of 15. But what happened after was a series of maybe coincidences, but the family believed that these were all too precise to be random. And the family felt like Janet had been reaching out to them after death. Now, not many details about what they experienced were published publicly, but a few things were. So there was a wet spot on the roof of the home, during a period of drought. There was no trees over the house or anything like that. And there was no rain that had fallen. And it was right on Janet's bedroom, and they interpreted it as a sign from Janet. There was also a clock in the home that had stopped working at the exact time that Janet had passed, which is a classic sign and indication that there's an ongoing presence around. There was also a birthday card that had been sent to Richard, her brother, before she passed away. And I don't know exactly what was written inside, but they said that what was inside was just oddly foreshadowing. And it became a symbol for the family after her tragic head injuries. Now, these events are what prompted Maurice to join the SPR. And he had explicitly volunteered to take on any interesting cases that may have come forward. Now, on or around September 4th, George Fallows had contacted Eleanor O'Keefe, the SPR secretary, for some help. She immediately thought of Grosse, And he agreed to investigate on the spot and drove over the next day. But by the time he arrived in the home, the house was kind of already in full poltergeist mode. So he arrived on September 5th in the late afternoon, early evening, and he was accompanied by George Fallows and David Thorpe. His first impression, in his own words, was that he found chaos. The whole family was congregated in the house together with the neighbors next door, and there were a lot of frightened people there. Now, Peggy Hodgson was huddled together with her 4 children. She was overwhelmed and trying to hold it together for her kids, but they were all scared out of their minds. Vic and Peggy Nottingham were there, and sometimes would come back with their son Gary, who had been helping since the first night. Now, everyone was exhausted. I mean, how could you not be after days of flying Legos, marbles, knocks, and just the lingering shock of what had just started to happen? And the house was just overcrowded. It was noisy. Everybody was cramping in the living room and the front bedroom for their safety, really. So that day, he had observed the family and really took a hold of the situation. He advised Peggy to stay calm despite the chaos, and he told her to start keeping detailed notes of the events. What happened, where, and when, and this later became some of the most valuable information in the case. He also explained that the panic could make things worse, kind of like egging the entity on. So he said that they needed to treat it like any other household problem. Like, it's just there. Don't pay too much mind to it, but you have to fix it. And he began all of his preliminary observations and notes with the other journalists. But nothing really crazy happened that day. There was still some knocks and some other flying toys around, but nothing that hadn't already been documented. So I guess he left and he returned later on because he wanted more evidence before jumping full force into this thing. So on September 8th, 3 days later, he came back with some more reporters from the Daily Mirror. Around 1:15 a.m., a loud crash came out of nowhere. Everyone rushed to the children's room where a chair had been flipped over and slid about a meter across the floor. Janet and Margaret were still sleeping. Now, this was a specific moment that Gross knew that this case was going to be worth his time. He had begun classifying the events, the marbles dropping from nowhere, a shirt flew off the table near Gross at one point, and teaspoons jumping, drawers and doors opening with no one near them, just everything that was going on. And these events weren't just seen by Gross, but by the journalists, by the Hodgsons, by the Nottinghams. And then he quickly realized that this entity was smart. As soon as they'd walk from a room, something would happen in that room, so they had to turn around and go see it, kind of like teasing, the entity was teasing them. But this day is considered the official start of the investigation, and over the next 14 months, he recorded over 180 hours of audio recordings. There were pictures taken. He kept notebooks with records of what was happening. There were thousands of incidents logged, and it became one of the most well-documented poltergeist cases ever. So, on October 26th, an event occurred. It happened in the front room of the home, where Guy Leon Playfair, who was another British journalist and paranormal researcher, he was sleeping directly across the hall in a box room. I guess it's just a really small bedroom. And he captured this whole event on camera. Investigators and family had been paying close attention to a built-in fireplace in the main bedroom. And it was a heavy fireplace, Victorian cast iron style unit, which is cemented solidly into the brickwork and weighs at least 50 pounds. Now, on October 24th to 25th, investigators recorded heavy knocks and vibrations coming from around the fireplace. On October 26th, Janet was heard saying, "It's trying to push it upside down." Peggy replied she didn't want to say what she thought. And Playfair physically shook the fireplace himself, and it wouldn't budge. Those things are, insanely heavy if you've ever seen one, or even, a picture of one. Those things are not movable. They're so heavy. But he said right on tape that he couldn't get it out, and he knows it's not going to do that. And the grate had already been thrown across the room just 2 days earlier and narrowly missed Billy's head while he was in bed. Peggy was just so terrified that something was going to happen and somebody was going to get hurt. So on October 26th, now Playfair was lying in bed in the little room across the hall. Peggy, Janet, Margaret, and Billy were still in bed and not awake yet. Now, this was all recorded on tape. It's not a video, it's just on audio tape. You can hear a sudden violent shaking sound erupting, like metal banging, like hard, and panic. Everyone starts to panic. Peggy yells, "Oh Lord, all that power. That's it. I'm getting out." The entire iron frame had been pulled from the wall. It was standing on a crazy angle on the floor, like with the gas pipe still attached to it. They said the pipe was bent to a 32-degree angle. A portion of the fireplace flew across the room. The grate started rattling like it was ready to be thrown again. Margaret is heard kind of giggling nervously in the background, and they all panicked, but joked with dark humor that the entity was trying to get Peggy to leave the home. Peggy Nottingham, whose bedroom wall was directly behind the fireplace, heard the screams and the wrenching through the wall. Now, the bending of the gas pipe alone would require a great force of leverage. There was just absolutely no way that it could have been a hoax, especially by the suspected 2 young girls. Because everybody kind of was like, oh, these girls are just playing pranks. And they did admit later on to the fact that some of the stuff that happened was just a couple of pranks, but not any of these major events, just like little stupid stuff. And this also wasn't just the isolated incident that day. A heavy settee lifted and flipped over in front of multiple witnesses. And this was while the girls were at school. There was also chairs, tables, and other furniture that slid and overturned in the rooms while they were being observed, like while other people were in those rooms. Now, during the investigation, multiple photos were taken by Gross and Playfair. Janet appearing airborne or thrown horizontally across her bedroom. Now, witnesses like Hazel Short had seen her tossed up and down to window height. But on November 7th, 1977, the tape supports authenticity of some images, and I'll post the pictures on my social media pages so you guys can check them out for yourself. Now, this is among one of the most debated but visually striking pieces of evidence in this case. It was around the end of November 1977 when the events had started escalating dramatically. Gross and Playfair used photographs triggered manually or remotely to try and capture any phenomena. Now, the video equipment had been kind of unreliable because there was like low light, and this was back, this was in the 70s, so the video equipment wasn't really great, and they were having problems with it. So they used just, photos. Now, they said that Janet often entered trances or convulsions before levitating. Her limbs contorted, and her body became very rigid. And it's not the one time that it happened. It happened multiple times while they were observing her, and sometimes when she was alone. So, on November 10th, they documented Janet levitating in a sitting position about 4 feet in the air with a chair cushion under her. Like she was still sitting on the chair, and she just got lifted up. And it was witnessed by 7+ people in the room. On November 12th at 9:05 p.m., she was allegedly tipped or thrown from the bed onto the floor. Like someone picked up the mattress and tipped her off the bed, if you get what I'm saying. But Graham Morris captured pictures of her levitating in an evening vigil. Janet appeared to rise from her bed in rapid sequence. Morris insisted that there was some sort of force involved and claimed that there was no way this was an ordinary jump in the air. She was in a deep trance, and Gross tried to restrain her In one shot, Janet is horizontal mid-room. In others, she's vertical with her sibling behind in the background screaming. And I'll definitely post those pictures because they're crazy. But the photos do show Janet's body looking like stiff, floating in the air. There's also a rare photo of the impact Janet took as she was thrown to the ground in one of these pictures, which I'll have to see if I can find that one. Some skeptics have tried to disprove the photographs, but the paranormal researchers explain that a normal jump just wouldn't match with the way her body was positioned in the air. Plus the multiple witnesses you have, again. But I'll post the pictures, like I said, and you can make the, decision for yourself. Now, Janet was drugged from her bed and you can hear this on an audio tape. The audio tapes aren't online, but the people who have heard it say that it sounds very, very real. So, I said December 3rd, 1977. Gross and others logged similar forceful movements, and there's a website, Triabolog, I think. I always forget exactly what it's called. But it breaks down the tapes and emphasizes this as hard to fake. I'll post the link in the description of this podcast so you can go in there and look if you decide to, because it's an interesting website. They have a lot of information about this. This is one of the most chilling pieces of evidence. It happened in the early hours around 1:20 a.m. And everybody was in the front bedroom where they had all been sleeping together because of everything that was going on. Now, this happened twice in the same night. The lights were on in the room, and everybody was just about to go to sleep. Janet suddenly gasps and was starting to be pulled by an unseeable force. She was dragged across the room on her stomach, and it was like there's, they have a bunch of beds in the room, like moved in the room, so there's stuff kind of just everywhere. And she's being dragged around the beds, not even like over top, like around the beds and the dressers out of the bedroom. Now, she goes through these narrow doorways, which is only about 18 inches it was open. She goes around the bends in the hallway and then partially down the stairs. And she yells, "Mom," in distress. And you can hear like the groaning and the breathing heavily as her mom screams. Now, Gross yells out, "That's incredible. How did she get through there?" Talking about the doorway because it was only open like 18 inches. Then, 10 minutes later, same thing happens again. She starts to get pulled, but she kind of tries to fight it. She gets to her feet and she's trying to fight it off. So she screams, "Mom, it's dragging me." And pretty much the same thing around the stuff in the room and the hallway, partially down the stairs. John Burcombe, Peggy's brother, was also at the house. He and others had tried to grab Janet, saying that she weighed a ton. And Peggy said, "I couldn't believe it. I've never seen anything like that." You hear all the screaming and the shuffling on the tape, and Janet nervously yelling, "Get out, you old cow," talking to the poltergeist, because at this point, they're just trying to use their dark humor to keep the mood alive, I guess. Like, I don't know how, like, this is, like, intense. So, I don't know how you could even sleep in this house. Like, I would have had to go. But I guess Peggy owns the house, so you're not leaving, especially when you don't have money. But anyway, so Peggy Nottingham also said she heard the events happening in her home through the wall, but no one was physically injured, and you can hear the genuine panic on the tape. Now, these are just normal people, they're not trained actors. So for it to sound very genuine, I just wouldn't think it was being faked. Multiple witnesses and everything, and the countless people who have traveled to London and to listen to these tapes, because these tapes are archived in London. I believe that they're trying to get them digitized, but it hasn't happened yet. I will be ecstatic if it does, because I would love to listen to some of these because it's just wild. Anyway, so most skeptics don't even try to make sense of what has happened on this tape. One person did say that Janet may suffer from sleep paralysis, which, if you have experience with sleep paralysis, it doesn't make you get dragged across the floor. Like, I have experience with sleep paralysis. I get it sometimes. It is the most scary thing, and like I start breathing all crazy in my sleep, and my husband like has to like half wake me up because I'm like breathing all nuts, and I wake him up out of his sleep. So it's not fun, but that's not what happens. Like, she's not like, you don't sleepwalk. So I mean, maybe some people do in some cases, but I would feel like that's like different. I don't know. Because I don't sleepwalk. But anyway, so now the event, this event that I'm going to talk about, the next one, remains one of the most analyzed and debated elements of this case. This is the emerging. This is what gets me, because you can listen to some of these tapes. This is the emerging of the Bill Wilkins voice. Crazy creepy, so interesting. Now on December 10th, Maurice Gross and Guy Leon Playfair, along with some other visiting members from the SPR community, were in the front bedroom with the Hodgson family. The activity started with knocks and objects being moved around, the normal stuff. There was occasional whistles and some barks coming from Janet. Now, Gross kind of challenged the barks and the whistles that were coming from Janet. She was like, "Oh, if you can bark and you can whistle, then you can talk. So now we just need to hear the ghost talk," or something along the lines of that. I listened to the tape. You can actually listen to that on YouTube. It's wild. I will find the link and I will post that in the description as well. But other people in the home specifically remember him requesting the voice to speak that night. And almost immediately, there was a cluster of dog growls and barks and some whistles that came from Janet's direction. And I don't know if these were actually just coming from thin air or from Janet. But suddenly, in a gruff, guttural voice, a harsh elderly man began cursing and making crude remarks. And he introduced himself as Joe Watson, or some people say Joe Wilson as well. And it was completely unlike the voice of an 11-year-old girl. It came embodied through Janet. And after that, there was no other physical phenomena that happened that night. On December 11th, the voice came back, but now corrected his name and called himself Bill Wilkins. He claimed he had lived in the house years earlier. And when investigators did look into it, there was a Bill Wilkins who lived in the home years earlier. Nobody knew about this man. The family, Peggy Hodgson, did not know about this man. So he started making strange requests, and it was said that he still lived there and was sleeping in Janet's bed. He also liked to annoy people, he told them, and that he was invisible because he was a ghost ghost. Now, the voice also started announcing, like, the things that it was going to do beforehand. Like, he would say he's going to make something disappear, and then something was moved. On December 12th, the Gross's son, Richard, came, to do some questioning and also observe that day. On tape, the voice gave an extremely coherent and later verified explanation of its death. It said, "I was blind and I had a hemorrhage. I fell asleep and I died on a chair in the corner downstairs." It claimed to be 72 at the time of death. And Richard pressed for more details, but the voice kind of lied, it swore, it rambled, but it did get the core death story straight. And the interrogation is one of the most chilling tapes. The voice is clear, vulgar, confused, and oddly childlike at times despite the gruff tone. I did find some of the recordings, so I'll put that link in the description. It's wild. It's creepy. Now, some of the people have tried to disprove this, But speech therapist Daphne Pierce examined Janet thoroughly. She had no hoarseness, no bit damage to her vocal cords, and both of which she would have if she was making the voice herself, and there was no normal explanation for it. Now, later on, Gross and Playfair also tested this with like a glass of water in her mouth and her mouth taped shut, but the voice still came through. Sometimes it was a little muffled, but other times it was crystal clear, and that fact is just like truly terrifying to me because nothing they were doing stopped it. Now, from dozens of hours of tapes, the voice seemed to have its own personality. He swore a lot, he was vulgar and misogynistic, he was obsessed with crude topics like sex and periods, he was a habitual liar, an anti-religious, mischievous, and a bit confused. And it didn't just talk, it would direct the phenomena occurring, which I just said a little bit ago. And years later, Bill Wilkins' son did confirm that that was his father. It was the way he spoke, the personality, as well as the details of his death. Now, Bill Wilkins had died on June 20th, 1963, which the Hodgsons knew nothing about. So I wonder if, like, Peggy and her husband at the time had bought the house right after his death. Like, he died in the house, and then maybe nobody else lived in it, and then they bought it right after his death. But anyway, the voice appears on dozens of tapes, sometimes even coming disembodied from empty rooms. So on December 15th, 1977, this was a major day. That morning, there was a peak of multi-witness events. Gross and Playfair, along with physicist David Robertson from Burbank College, was at the house, and they were setting up cameras, just, trying to get some pictures. It was around breakfast time, and they were setting the cameras up in Janet's room. Bill Wilkins' voice addressed him through Janet, saying, "All right, David, boy, I'll make it disappear." Almost immediately, a large red cushion vanished from the living room downstairs. Robertson and others rushed to check what was going on and found the cushion missing. The windows were all shut, but moments later, it appeared on the front roof of the house, clearly visible from the street. No one saw it move physically, and it drew attention towards Janet's window. So in the early afternoon, multiple people witnessed Janet levitating. Some described circular motion and objects slamming against a window and not falling. Now, the house faces a busy street directly across from a school, Brimstown Primary. So at this time, children were being let out of school, and Hazel Short, who was the local council lollipop lady, who was the crossing guard, if you didn't know that's what that meant, was on duty across the street. She saw Janet going up and down, like through the window, in a horizontal position, reaching near window height, and then being tossed again. She described how books and a candy-striped pillow were slamming into the window in sequence, like book, then pillow, then book, then pillow, and continued to circle around the room without dropping. In an interview, she emphasized the pattern for like the bang from the book and then the pillow, the bang from the book, then the pillow, which is what called her attention to the home. One of Hazel's friends, who was also passing by, corroborated the story and witnessed Janet airborne. So a local baker delivery driver named John Rainbow also witnessed the same levitating event in the bedroom with the object swirling and Janet in the air. He described the non-dropping objects against the closed window and confirmed the sequence was short. So, at least 2 unnamed neighbors witnessed the event and reported similar sightings through Gross and Playfair. Robertson suspected that 4 total due to the busy street timing, and then maybe more because the kids getting out of school, but who knows. Now, a neighbor's dog that was said to never bark became agitated, was let out of his house, ran to the fence facing the Hodgson's house, and began to bark furiously and nothing visible, which added just the extra layer that this was harder to fake. Now, skeptics often reduce this to only 2 witnesses and say that there's no photos of the exact moment that everything happened. But researchers will keep saying that this is the strongest day of phenomena, and the entity was pretty much showing off for everyone, even the people outside. At one point in early January, the voice had become embodied through Margaret, and it was the same the same gruff, harsh, elderly man tone. It was vulgar, it swore a lot, and was confused in the same way as the voice that came through Janet, just a little less intense. This was noted because the entity began spreading its communication through others in the household. Now, February 6th was the day that they caught the disembodied voice in an empty room. Another extremely strong piece of evidence, and it was away from the girls. So the middle upstairs bedroom was completely empty. All of the kids were downstairs, and the investigators were hanging around and monitoring everything. Playfair set up an EVP recorder in the empty room. First, there was a thumping that sounded like items being lifted and dropped. Then, very clearly, a loud voice said, "Here I come," which was then followed by growling and yelping. The voice was louder and clearer than some of the ambient floorboard creaks that you could hear on the tape. And after the session, items were found moved around the room. Playfair and Gross has stated that this was unmistakable and inexplainable. It's also considered one of the best recordings of the voice within the case. In March of 1978, the voice started coming through Peggy Hodgson herself. And the incident was at a local shop when she was with her brother, John Burcombe. No children were present at the time, and the voice suddenly came through Peggy, swearing at her brother. Peggy was completely unaware it was happening to her until her brother's reaction. He later said he would stake his every being on it being real. Now, he's moving beyond Janet and Margaret into other people in the home, but not even at home. Like, it's crazy that this happened outside of the house to me. But anyway, so on March 19th, during a kind of experiment, this is when they had sealed Janet's mouth shut with the surgical tape, and they said the voice came through completely clearly, and there's just absolutely no way to explain how or why. In May of 1978, physicist John Hasted decided to do an experiment. He tested the weight against Janet's levitation. So he had like this machine, and I don't know exactly how it works or whatever, but pretty much she experienced a levitation episode. He measured the weight change, and he said it increased at 1 kilogram in 5-second bursts, then gradually increase over time, then returning to normal. There's no reason why this would happen. And he also witnessed a glass light bulb explode in a way that was considered to be very rare. Now, these controlled tests were done alongside David Robertson's work, and he also witnessed a sideboard overturning, a plate striking him, and his hair being pulled while he slept in a room. Which, that creeps me out more than anything. Something that's not there pulling your hair while you're sleeping. Ugh, so creepy. But anyway, the SPR committee was formed at the time to start reviewing all of the evidence that they were collecting, because there was just so much happening, so that they could prove and they can conclude that these were credible witnesses to everything. Now, from June to October of 1978, the voices and the movements continued to happen when the girls were not home. Phenomena started actually to spill into the Nottingham's home next door. Small fires had started to randomly start and then extinguish themselves. Picture frames were thrown from the walls. Heavy furniture continued to overturn. And the voice had become associated with more aggressive behavior. There were even choking attempts that had happened. Like, insane. And in October, a Dutch healer and clairvoyant, I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly, Dono Melig Myling. She had visited the home, and had said that some of the activity were connected to Gross's deceased daughter as well. A theory that Gross kind of thought about sometimes, especially because, like, Janet, 11-year-old Janet, and then his daughter's name was Janet, so, like, there was an element there of connection. But anyway, by October of 1978, all of the major disturbances had largely subsided. Gross and Playfair attended 180 plus visits and 25 overnight vigils. There were minor echoes that continued into 1979, but nothing really substantiating. Janet and Margaret later admit that they faked some of the minimal things, but the major events were all 100% real. Which, I don't even know why you would have to add anything to this. This is crazy enough. But anyway, the Hodgson's family lived under intense media scrutiny after 1979. People were skeptical. The children endured bullying. They suffered psychological effects from the situation. And Janet and Margaret were really under the spotlight for a while, but the boys had stayed clear of the spotlight. Peggy Hodgson never moved out of the home. And even after her children had moved on, she did report a feeling of a lingering presence. And she passed away in 2003. Janet had often been sent out of the home, and a lot of the times when this was happening, and because the disturbances would stop when she left for the most part. But, like, that made her feel like the black sheep of the family, and she felt like her mom didn't really want her back in the house because she was afraid the entity would come back, that's just a very sad thing, like a very sad way to live your childhood. So Janet left home at 16 and married very young. She spent time in a children's home run by nuns and was eventually sent to the Maudsley Hospital under psychiatric care of Dr. Peter Fenwick. School was brutal for her. She became known as Ghost Girl. She later spoke about the deep, lasting trauma that this caused her. She had married twice and had 4 boys. Her oldest son passed away at the age of 18 from an undiagnosed heart condition, and it was said that he had died in his sleep. In a 2023 interview, she said, "I've never really said this to anyone, but you never really feel completely yourself. It's something you never forget. It's never left me." She said she still felt like there was something behind her, and that she avoided going up the stairs alone for years. Well, I don't blame her. Like, I would too. Now, she has blamed herself, though, as the epicenter, and wondered if it had something to do with her energy that, like, she attracted this and invited it in. In 2016, she returned to the home with Margaret for the first time in years. And while research was being done for The Conjuring 2, she actually, gave them some information of what happened. But she was heavily featured on Apple TV's The Enfield Poltergeist. I have not watched it. I really want to. I want to see what it's all about. But I am cheap and I don't have a bunch of streaming services. So if you've seen it, let me know what you think of it in the comments below, because I do want to watch it. I think it's like a 4-piece thing, a series or whatever. But anyway, Margaret has been more private than Janet, but she did join Janet in the research of The Conjuring 2. Johnny unfortunately passed away in 1981 at the age of 14 or 15, from what I read was cancer. Billy has remained completely out of the public eye. No interviews, just very low profile, trying to move on with his life. And the family story is just mixed with trauma and resilience. This whole case is so interesting that I do hope the records become more accessible to the public at some point in the future, because it would be really, really cool to, like, actually see the information behind it. And like I said, there's numerous books and movies that were inspired by these events. Guy Leon Playfair wrote a book, This House is Haunted, the true story of the Enfield Poltergeist. Another person, Melvin Willen, wrote about the tapes that he transcribed. The Enfield Poltergeist, one of the most disturbing cases in history. What really happened? And, of course, The Conjuring 2, The Enfield Poltergeist on Apple TV. And there's other documentaries and stuff like that. But that's it for today. And I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Like I said before, love a good ghost story. I have experience with ghosts. I don't care if anybody doesn't believe me. I know what I've experienced, and I am 1,000% sure that there are ghosts out there. And I do feel like Janet was a stressful time in her life, and that is when things start presenting themselves more, is like when you're in like really bad stress. So yeah, I mean, I believe this 1,000%. I do want to see all the information one day, though. Anyway, but that's it for today. Also, don't forget to find me on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and check out my other podcasts as well. Stay safe out there. Until next week.